Hello, Africa. And you can clap if you want. You can sing if you want. You can even dance if you want. Hello, Africa. Hello, Africa. How you do, Africa? Tell me how you do, Africa. How you do, Africa? Tell me how you do, Africa. How you do, Africa? Well, hello, Africa. How you do, Africa? Well, hello, Africa. How you do, Africa? Tell me how you do, Africa. How you do, Africa? Tell me how you do, Africa. How you do, Africa? You sent me away with an empty heart. How you do, Africa? I wanna get back and make a fresh start. How you do, Africa? You sent me away with an empty heart. How you do, Africa? I wanna get back and make a fresh start. How you do, Africa? Well, hello, Africa. How you do, Africa? Well, hello, Africa.
Yeah, good morning, viewers. I'm here with you again. Today is our fourth Sunday in the month of December. Now, I would like to begin by wishing all of Guyana season greetings, and that includes our Christmas, our old years, our new years, and everything in between. I trust that God will bring some blessings to all the families who have been a part of this program over the years, and for all of Guyana. I would also like at this point to send out our condolences, that is on behalf of the Forbes Bonham Foundation, to Mrs. Barbara Gaynor's family, who has passed away. She has been a stalwart in the party over the years. And then we have Mrs. Yvonne Lonk Waite, who also passed away quite recently. We express our condolences to the family and loved ones. Today's program will be an interesting one because we will be doing a review on highlights of the year, things that have been significant during the year 2020 so far. We still have a few days before the year is ended, but we're trying to focus on those major things that were highlighted during the year. And to help me along, I should say to you, we were hoping to have an exchange with your involvement, making your comments and expressing your views. But it seems as though COVID is affecting even the equipment that we have to use. Our telephone today is not working. I hope GT&T will move with some degree of alacrity to have it fixed so that when we're using the studio, we can have an interaction with members of the public. Now, that is out, but joining me on these highlights today is the chairman of the foundation, Mr. Vincent Alexander. And there are some topics that we will be highlighting. In fact, I can list them for you. I was hoping that you can contribute to them. One of the major things for this year, elections. And we're going to be looking as well as at elections reform. Then we will be looking at the judgment of the controversy at the World Court that was given quite recently. And then we will be looking at a strange disposition and development in Guyana, the dismissal of public servants from their jobs since this new government has gone into power. Then we're going to be talking also about the death of the Henry Boys. You know, that is an issue that is very current in the minds of all of Guyana. Then we would like to tell you also that COVID over the year has affected the activities of the foundation, and we will be telling you about that and how they have done that. Then the ERC conversation, which has started, and those are some of the highlights. Then last but by no means least, the meeting of past presidents. I know The current president has invited President Granger to a meeting with past president, which he has not attended for reasons he has given. Those are some of the major highlights, and I was just hoping that you too would have had something to put into the list. But we can start with that. Now, with me in the studio today is, like I said, is Mr. Vincent Alexander, who will help me along with these highlights. Well, first of all, on the list I have elections and elections reform. Vincent, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Clayton. May I join with you in wishing all Guyanese the best for the season, starting with Christmas, going on to the New Year, and in fact, because we will not be on before the New Year, to wish all Guyanese a very productive 2021. I'd also like to join with you in extending condolences to the relatives of our two stalwart members who passed since we last were on program. Those persons are Sister Barbara Dino. Barbara was a very, very active person in the Burnham Foundation, never missed an activity, and called us out from time to time when she thought we weren't, in fact, doing enough. Another stalwart member was Sister Yvonne Lunk-Waite. She has not been around for quite a while due to illness, but even in her physical absence, continued to inquire about and to make her regular contributions to the work of the foundation. So our condolences go out to their families. Clayton, as you correctly said, the big issue this year probably occupied all of the year, the question of elections. And this has resulted in a number of things. It has resulted in a new government being sworn in, on one hand. It has resulted in a number of people being brought before the courts. If I were to describe that, I would say being persecuted. And it's resulted in some people calling for electoral reform. First of all, let me comment on the people who are being persecuted. We had elections in March
The 2nd of March, 2020.
March the 2nd. We eventually had the announcement of results in July.
Mm-hmm.
In July. So we have had from July to December a clear 7 months. A clear 7 months. And these people were charged and brought before the court at the very inception of that July period. 7 months, and the police and the director of public prosecution are still to properly address the court on the substantive matters of what these people are charged with. These cases started with private matters. Private matters brought essentially by people associated with the People's Progressive Party, lawyers associated with the People's Progressive Party, and then they were taken over by the DPP. And even as they were taken over, initially some of the same people who brought the matters were being retained to prosecute these matters. There was a public outcry and they were subsequently dropped. But it's interesting that after 7 months of people being brought before the court, that the substantive matters still cannot be heard. And you know, I listened once to Barra Jagdeo on television, and his position was this: he doesn't know what the court will decide, so he didn't exhibit the confidence that the court will be able to convict these people. But he thought it necessary to malign these people, shout them out publicly in what could be considered acts of defamation, because these people have not been found guilty for anything. And I am confident that there's not much that will come of most of those charges, if not all, in terms of the police being able to prove these people were involved in anything which they are being charged for.
The PSC is also making.
But here comes the public.
They're
Correct.
making a lot of noise, and which I find very strange.
Here comes the public service, the public
Public sector,
private sector
sector commission.
calling for action to be taken against these people. And one wonders what is the agenda of the private sector commission. Are they people who embrace the rule of law? The rule of law would clearly show that you cannot go about dismissing people who have not been found guilty of any wrongdoing. But here they are calling for dismissal. So they are themselves trying to be judge and jury in these matters. But what is interesting is that this is a private sector commission which has historically been silent on the question of wrongdoings at GCOM. You know, everybody is in a hullabaloo about 2020. But we have to go back to 2006 if we want to really review the performance of GCOM. Because in 2006, GCOM declared a false result in Linden.
That's right.
A result which facilitated the occupation of a seat by one Mr. Sam Hines. GCOM admitted that they had in fact declared a false result, undertook to correct what they were referring to then as an error, and that's the practice. They call these false things, these fraudulent behaviors, errors. Proceeded to announce the results without the correction, and then advised the AFC, the affected party, that they have to go to court to settle this matter. And then participated in scuttling the substantive issue on technical grounds. So the substantive issue of GCOM declaring a false result, giving a seat in Linden to the PPP, which was rightfully won by the AFC, was never settled. And all of these people who were keeping noise about fraudulent elections were silent on this matter, a matter which was beyond the shadow of doubt, a fraudulent act. And then we had the situation in 2011, where the then chief elections officer brought a fraudulent result to the commission. Fortunately, you were able to discern the attempt at fraud and to reverse it. But there's no question about what the chief elections officer was attempting to do. What did the PPP say then? That the system worked. The system worked, and the man who sat there and brought this, they were prepared to have him remain as the chief elections officer. The private sector commission
Was mum.
was mum on this matter.
Not a word.
They had early knowledge. I can attest to the fact that they had early knowledge in this matter, and they was mum. But what did the PPP say? The system worked. The system worked to have that man remain until the end of his contract. 2015 elections, there were accusations that there was an attempt to insert false statements of poll into the system for the declaration of the results. Again, these people were silent. Nobody called for this review of GCOM and all of that is being called for now. But in 2020, they all seem to have some agenda. An agenda which permitted them, even before the elections, to take positions. I had direct interaction with people from the private sector commission before elections. And I made the point then to them that the argument that the systems were perfect was ill-founded. And that in a system where there's a bloated list, you cannot talk about perfection. And that in addition to the bloated list, it allowed for the possible involvement of the human factor. I raised these matters with the Private Sector Commission, and they argued at that time that the system was perfect and nothing can go wrong. And now they're the ones who are taken to my argument of the human factor. An argument that something that they argued against before elections. And now they are saying, well, get rid of these people. That's the human factor they're talking about. And I brought it to their attention that once you have a bloated list, then there's a problem you can have because the human factor can manipulate the bloated list. And without any reference to the petition, it is argued now, in fact, that the human factor manipulated the bloated list because I have seen evidence. I have seen evidence of instances where people who were dead were voted for. Nobody's talking about that. There's evidence that people overseas were voted for, so that the human factor was active in manipulating the bloated list. And therefore, if we are going to talk about reform at GCOM, we can't allow Jagio to tell us the only reform GCOM needs is removal of some
Removal
people.
of people.
Because when those people are removed, the bloated list continues to be there. And the opportunities for what occurred in 2020 in terms of dead people voting and in terms of overseas people voting
Will continue.
can continue.
That's right.
So that what GCOM has to do is not to address only the question of the human factor. The human factor is negated largely if the systems are in place, an element of which is the register of registrants and the voters list. And so if we talk about reform of GCOM, one of the major things we have to address is the question of the voters list. How do we ensure that we do not have a voters list that is bloated by tens of thousands of people that can be manipulated and that in fact was manipulated in the 2020 elections? That has to be what has to be addressed. Why isn't the Private Sector Commission calling for that to be corrected? Are they party to the utilization of the bloated list that caused them to be silent, but to be pointing their fingers at people when in 2006, 2011, and 2015 they were patently silent on things that occurred which suggested from then that GCOM need to be reviewed?
There's a view out there, Vincent, that the narrative that kind of developed prior to the elections and during that period, that impasse, the narrative that was developed by the PPP is a narrative that they were aware of the failure of GCOM to correct the list, and which they had agreed to, which they never carried through, and when it was attempted, they scuttled the whole thing.
Well, I wouldn't quite address this as the failure of GCOM to address the list. Because GCOM did embark on the house-to-house registration, which would have sufficed for addressing the matter of the list. But the GCOM's intention was stymied by the court ruling. The court ruling which suggests that one could not take a name off of the register. And so I wouldn't say GCOM was at fault in that regard, but certainly those persons who took the matter to court seem to have an agenda, because they were the ones who sought to ensure, and the People's Progressive Party was integral to the movement.
That there was no change.
Having voted the money in Parliament for registration.
Well, that's the point I was trying to.
Having voted the money in Parliament for the exercise to be undertaken in 2019, they became party to stymieing that exercise through a court process. So they must have had an agenda that caused them to take such action.
You have addressed the issue of the issue that needs to be done, the human factor. No, every time we have elections, we have these kind of acrimonious accusations being leveled against different parties. As it is right now, in your view, you were on the commission, what is a necessity moving forward in relation to one, the list, one, our election kind of cycle, inclusive of all the attendant requirements that need to be done so that we can have, as far as possible, something that is acceptable, both locally and internationally?
Let me address that this way. In 2015, the international community and all the sundry came out and said we had a good election in 2015. In 2020, the same people came out and said up to March the 2nd that we had a good election. People seem to forget that. So in a sense, they were making a comment about GCOM's capacity
Okay.
to run a proper election. The furore came after March the 2nd about the declaration of results. What is obvious to me is that the major problem is the register of registrants.
Okay.
Because manipulation largely takes place in a manner as to allow numbers to turn up that are not representative of the actual number of valid votes. And that's why the whole question of valid votes must count became a central issue.
So the reform need to address that.
And so the reform needs to address that. How do we ensure that we go to the elections with a clean list, and by virtue of that, ensure that people who are not authorized to vote do not find votes being cast for them in one way or the other, by other people falsely turning up and casting votes for them, or by manipulations at the point of the count after the poll has been closed. And a lot of this rests on the quality of the list. You can't manipulate if you don't have excess names that one can then be utilized to bring about that manipulation, be it during the actual voting or after the voting, during the process of the count.
So that's an issue
I think
that
is
the major
that is
issue
the
of
major
reform
issue of reform.
that need to be
The
addressed.
question of the human factor, they have things in court. Let's hear what the court has to say.
All right.
Let's hear what the court has to say.
Well,
Let's
I want
not have people like the private sector commission attempting to prejudice, to make the environment acid against those persons who have been charged and for whom 7 months the police can come to the court with the substantive matters, and who are being, I would say, prosecuted for all intents and purposes. The manner of the conduct of the police is tantamount to persecution. People being taken down to the station, being held for extended periods, with no real action happening during the extended periods, just being held as if to force these people to make statements so they can go free from false imprisonment, I would say. So let the court have its say on those matters, and let us address the question, which we can address immediately, the question of how do we deal with the bloated list.
And you said one of the ways electoral reform. I want to rest. That is the highlight, one of the first highlight for 2020 that we are dealing with on this program. I want to move quickly to
Well, let's touch briefly on the question of electoral reform. I think electoral reform is going to go beyond the list. There are, I have taken the position for some time now, and the Bonham Foundation has taken that position, that these elections which we have are dysfunctional because they do not address the needs of Guyana in terms of ensuring we have a system that is representative of the interests of all Guyanese when a government gets in place. And this is patently manifest even today by actions that are being taken by the government. We had a constitution reform process, which process agreed that we will reform the electoral system to allow for a larger number of constituencies. Had we were not able in 2001 to do that because the time frame was short. We had to have elections in 2001. There wasn't enough time to go and draw new constituencies, and we simply accepted the 10 regions as 10 constituencies for the time being. From 2001 to 2020, a commitment that the political directorate and the parliament took has not been fulfilled. That speaks to the question of the deficiencies of our system. How could we, in 2001, say, yes, we're going to do this? We actually placed in our constitution a provision for a constitutional reform committee in parliament. And 19 years, nothing has occurred. And nobody seems to be concerned about that. So that there is need for reform of the electoral system that would provide for a different configuration expressing the will of the people. And I would go further to say there's a need for reform in terms of the governance system that would ensure that a minority government cannot impose its will on the people. We have had those instances of minority government. Nor that a minority of the people, and not a small minority, a large minority, a minority that adds up to 40-something percent of the people, that minority cannot be left out of governance. Right now, that minority is left out of governance. The majority takes all of the decisions, who constitute boards, who don't constitute boards, and all of that. And that minority is left out, and that minority is told that we are government, we are running this place, and if you don't recognize us, we're not talking to you. But the fact of the matter is, recognition or no recognition, they are running the place and excluding the minority from its rightful involvement in decision making in this country.
And the reform should take those
and
factors
the reform should also
into
take
account.
those factors into consideration, because we still have a divided society. All of our elections have turned out to be an ethnic census, notwithstanding what some people would say, an ethnic census, and therefore we do not have that comfort zone of everybody when one party is in government, one or the other, about their affairs, their interests being looked after. And so we have to address that question. Until we address that question, we will not have the kind of stability in this country that will facilitate development.
Yes.
And we must here differentiate between growth and development. You can have economic growth, but economic growth is not tantamount to development. Development has to do with improving the lives of people, your education system, your health system, and all of your other systems. And if those things don't change to ensure that everybody is a beneficiary, then in fact you're not having development. Some people getting contracts, some not getting. Where is the development in terms of people being able to access a proper livelihood?
Being empowered.
You know, so that we have a serious problem that is not being addressed, and people are just out there touting that they're going to have so much of investment. But who are going to be the beneficiaries, both in terms of the contracts to undertake development, and in terms of the returns from the investment. So that this talk about a bright future is a bright future for some, not a bright future for all. And I noticed Kaieteur News in today's editorial has recognized that fact and spoken to that fact, that investment in itself does not spell a bright future for Guyanese.
I like that because I had listed some issues, but I think you have covered elections, covered electoral reform, and what needs to be done. Well, of course, I'm sure that you can't address all that is required, but of course, you have highlighted some major areas that need to be considered moving forward in electoral reform. Now, I want to go quickly to the other one I have here, judgment of the border controversy recently at the World Court. I know it has an interesting history, and today we're at a position where it is the feeling of most Guyanese that this kind of judgment falls squarely in our favor so far. Your comment on this judgment?
Well,
That's a big issue
let
for
me first of
2020.
all say that there is this proclamation and atmosphere of jubilance on the part of the president that the judgment is in our favor. I think that yes, the judgment is in our favor, but the judgment is not a final determination of the matter. All this judgment has done is to determine that the court has jurisdiction to determine the matter.
Okay.
So let us not be over-jubilant.
So exuberant.
There is still over-jubilant and exuberant. There is still the substantive issue to be addressed by the court. But I want to make an observation. The president says, well, if we are united, great things can be done. And he's using this instance of the fact that all Guyanese are supportive of what we're doing in terms of the border controversy. I want to make a different observation. The Burnham Foundation is committed and dedicated to memorializing and commemorating Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham.
That's true.
And when we get a judgment like that, we cannot help remembering Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. And I think the nation owes it to itself to recognize that the Geneva Agreement, which has led us to where we're at, is a product of the Burnham regime. And in fact, a product of the Burnham regime, which as a product has from time to time been criticized by the PPP. They've criticized elements of the
Geneva Agreement, I remember that.
They must now admit that Burnham has been vindicated by virtue of where that agreement has taken us. It has taken us to a position where the World Court will adjudicate on the matter. And so the Burnham Foundation wants to remind this nation that with all the vilification that takes place of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, that it is his regime that had the wisdom to enter into the Geneva Agreement, which has provided a clear path
For resolution.
of the matter. More than that, when you look at the people who are involved in prosecuting this matter on behalf of Guyana, again we have to turn and give accolades to Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. Because Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham cultivated the kind of human resource and the kind of team that today, decades after his death, are still contributing to the resolution of this matter on behalf of Guyana. Trashida Bamford is still integral to the process. Bartlett Scotland is still integral to the process. Carl Greenidge has been retained as the chief spokesman in the process. And what I'm saying is that all of these people were people thrown up under the Burnham regime that today are still contributing. And we must give accolades to the fact that Burnham was able, in his time, not only to come up with the Geneva Agreement, but to provide the kind of human resource who could properly be guardians of Guyana's territorial integrity and sovereignty unto today, when his party is no longer in government. It is a contribution that should be recognized, and people shouldn't just be worried about talking about unity. They should be talking about the man who has made this possible through his foresight and his leadership, going way back to post-independence.
I like that. Yes. And so that has been one of the highlights for 2020, the judgment at the World Court, and we are said, and you have admonished caution in terms of our jubilation. And the reason you have advanced is very, very clear. Now, I want to go to the other one, Vincent. Now, dismissal of public servants by this government since they took power. Now, that is a burning cry all over Guyana. And on the ground, people are suffering, particularly in relation to the current kind of pandemic that is creating havoc throughout the world. To be faced with kind of what I will call unceremonious kind of dismissals without reason in many cases. How that has been a highlight, say with
Well,
2020.
let me first of all clarify what is occurring. Much of what is being called dismissals are not in fact dismissals. They are termination under contracts with due notice and or payment in lieu of notice. So this claim that people are being dismissed is an attempt to besmirch image of people who are being terminated under provisions of their contract. There may be some dismissals, but in the main, this is what is occurring. This again points to the weaknesses of our systems and points to the fact that our politicians have not, over the decades, addressed a critical issue from a number of perspectives. First of all, we have not defined over the years what are political appointments. We've not defined that. Because one would expect in a system where there are political appointments, then if there's regime change, the people who are political appointees would simply demit office to allow the incoming government to similarly have political appointments. So I think that is one of the deficiencies. And all the talk we have in this country, nobody's addressing that question, that you need to clearly define which are political appointments and how do you deal with those. In other and this is not rocket science. In other places, it has been done. It has been done. So that's one. Secondly, we have affected the operation of the public service in a manner that allows for these terminations, because what has happened is that people have been appointed outside of the tenure system which the Public Service Commission provides for. They have been given contracts that allows for insecurity of tenure. And what we need to do is to return to the system of the public service that provides for security of tenure. Not everything the British gave us is bad. That is one of the things we inherited from the British. Security of tenure through the public service arrangement. But people have been encouraged by some enticement and so to go for jobs that are not tenure jobs, and then they suffer when the political regime utilizes the terms of the contract to get rid of them. Beyond that, one has to ask the question of justice and national interest. And I want to take the specific case of Vincent Adams, EPA. There's no Guyanese, none, who has argued that Vincent Adams' contract should not be renewed. In fact, the regime attempted to say we will consider a suitable appointment for Vincent Adams. And this is recognition that Vincent Adams, on one hand, is qualified for the job, but more than being qualified for the job, was doing a good job. And one has to ask the question, government has changed. You want loyal soldiers, so to speak. What is the scope of Vincent Adams? Not operating in the national interest
Right.
that can cause you to say he should not retain that job. And not only what is the scope, but what is the evidence? Everybody has concluded that this man is good for Guyana.
And was doing an excellent job.
And so there must be some ulterior motive,
Sinister, of course.
sinister. Anyone who wants to remove him, what purpose will that serve us? And so one has to have serious question marks about the motives that has informed the removal of people like Vincent Adams. I think a similar argument could be made for the removal of Baino, who is in charge of the
Energy sector.
energy sector. Here you have highly qualified guys whose performance could not be questioned, being removed. And what is interesting to note is that in many instances you have replacements of people who were there before and whose performance
A question.
under the last regime was questionable, under the PPP regime was questionable, and they've been brought right back and placed at the helm.
A name that come to mind is Denial.
You know, I'm not calling names. They have come right back and been placed at the helm when the evidence was that they were not fit for purpose, and that is the reason why they did not continue in those offices. So we have a system, again, is a question of the need for reform of our employment law, which allows for, I would say, victimization. It's not a system that seeks to speak to the question of a public service that is neutral. And a neutral public service is one where, irrespective of who's in government, the officers are there and they do the job
Security.
based on the rules and the regulations. But you know, in Guyana we have a problem with the rules and the regulations. Because in many instances, ministers are directly involved in administration. And that's the big problem we have. Ministers being directly involved in administration and not allowing the public service to do its job as is prescribed by our constitution. It reminds me of Mr. Hoyt in his attempt under his regime to rectify that when he sent out a circular to his ministers at that time advising them that they should not interfere in the work of the public service beyond policy guidance, and that they should allow the permanent secretaries
To do their job.
to do their jobs. That was a White circular. The circular has never been recalled. That circular is still, for all intents and purposes, what should pertain. But we have a situation where in this country, ministers get involved in the day-to-day administration. And the day-to-day administration should not be political, because the day-to-day administration has to do with the delivery of goods and services
To the people.
to the people without partisan involvement. And ministerial involvement in our country is highly partisan involvement.
Beautiful. I think that we're going great so far, Vincent. We're doing a review on some highlights for 2020. We have done electoral reform. We have looked at the judgment of the controversy between Guyana and Venezuela, the judgment that was recently handed down. We have looked at what I refer to as the dismissals, and you have put it in perspective as to what is really taking place right now in relation to our public servants. We're going down the line, and I'm sorry I don't have the phone, because I'm sure members of the public, you would have liked to be part of this conversation to make your contribution. But like I said, COVID is affecting everything, including some of the equipment we have in the studio. So our telephone is not working. I'm appealing to GT&T to make sure that they correct that anomaly quickly, so that persons who will be using the studio after me will have the benefit of the telephone, so that they can interact with you, the members of the public. But we're going good so far. We have covered 3 major areas, and we're going down the line. Not a highlight, very big topic all over Guyana, the death of the Henry boys and West Berbice. That has gripped the attention of not just people in Guyana, but the world. And this has been one of the issues, in fact, serious issues, that all of Guyana is talking about right now. Your comments on this one?
I think the handling of the Henry matter clearly points to the duplicity that we are victims of. We have had a president who said to the public that everything will be done, no stone will be left unturned to find the persons responsible for that heinous act of the murder of the Henry brothers and the Singh boy, Harris Singh. That is the public announcement. Under his regime, bodies who can consider to be non-political, the Guyana Human Rights Association, they have been there for the longest while, they criticize all governments, sought to lend to this process by inviting the Argentinians, who are known to have the expertise, the forensic expertise to deal with such matters, to come. And we had a downright situation of non-cooperation by the government, and specifically by the police force, under the leadership of the Ministry of Home Affairs. Non-cooperation. They have not, in fact, what they have done is to ensure that we do not have the best investigation of this matter. Now, what can we say? What can be the motive of a government?
That's a very serious indictment
Right.
on the part of the government in relation
That
to this.
itself seeks to tell the nation that it will do everything. How can we hereafter believe the pronouncements of a president and a government who, after making such a pronouncement in such a matter, does not follow through when every opportunity is made available to bring in the kind of personnel that will do what the government said they want done? This is duplicity at its highest. It is duplicity's highest. And it probably points to a characterization of what we are affected by. You know, if Guyanese are to really address their minds seriously to where we have come from in terms of this presidency, to where we're at, we will see there's a certain characterization that is evident in where we have come from to where we're at. Where we're at is duplicity. So the whole question is it's tantamount to dishonesty that you would tell the nation that you are going to do everything possible. And then when everything possible becomes available, you are the one to
Step
make
back.
sure that everything possible is not done. And so one may well have to end up saying, in a very figurative manner, that a government that does not do everything to resolve this matter has blood on its hands.
Well, I think the issue of the Henry Boys, it continued to, the action of the government continued to boggle the minds of all Guyana. And I, like you rightly said, I'm hopeful that they will retrace their steps and bring this matter to the earliest conclusion, because it is a matter that is of concern to all Guyanese. And I don't wish to say more on it,
But
but
I would say just a bit more. We know that this matter saw a lot of protests in the West Berbice area. And unfortunately, there were some incidents which were exaggerated, and I'm bold to say that, exaggerated. But the protest was essentially people calling,
for demanding action from the government.
and what the government did was to use the few incidents that occurred to literally send the police out there in a very violent manner to put down the protest. When, if they had proceeded to do all that was necessary, there would have been no need for protests. And so one really has to examine these issues carefully. The courses of action taken, what has motivated the courses of action, and the way in which even this matter was used to pit people against each other. Because the protests and the few incidents was used as if, once again, the Indo-Guyanese were under attack.
The
So
ethnic element.
this situation, which essentially is a matter of solving a crime, has been manipulated to become a matter of ethnic rivalry and ethnic suppression and one set of people taking advantage of another set of people. And if the government had handled it differently, the crime would be solved on one hand, and there would be no basis on which the government could then propagandize what occurred to suggest, that there are bad politicians and bad people, and there are good politicians and good people who are affected by the bad politicians and the bad people.
I just want to go to the other one. I think we're going good so far. The list, I'm going to the other one because these are just major issues, highlights for 2020. The meeting of the presidents. I saw in the media a letter of invitation from the president inviting the past presidents to a meeting. And my understanding is that the past President, Mr. Granger, did not accede to this request for reasons he has advanced. Now, what about this meeting? I mean, I would like to know this new development of inviting past presidents and so on to a meeting.
Well,
I really...
there are a number of angles to the matter. Let me start here. Prior to the declaration of the results, GCOM provided an opportunity for the leader of the People's National Congress Reform. I want to be specific about that. And the leader of the PPP, Granger and Jagdeo, to have a conversation about the way forward. That was provided prior to the declaration results. My information is, and it's official information, that the two gentlemen had a conversation. And on the insistence of Jagdeo, it was concluded that it wasn't timely to have any kind of talks before the declaration, that they should engage after the declaration. So for all intents and purposes, the two major parties committed an engagement after the declaration. I don't know who to blame, but I know they have not proceeded with that engagement, and once again this nation has been taken down a bottomless pit, because we were given the impression that these two parties, and I want to make the point, is the two parties that agreed, for all intents and purposes, to that meeting. The two leaders of the two parties. That didn't occur. We now have the president call in on Mr. Granger for a meeting among the presidents. Now, we don't have an institution of presidents.
No.
We haven't even agreed that we could have a collective of a place where we can collectively
Past presidents and the biodata
Commemorate.
being established at the same place.
and memorialize past presidents. Ramata said no way would he allow for Burnham and Jagan to be memorialized in the same place. Can associate past presidents. But here we have a situation where the president invites the past presidents, 3 PPP past presidents, and himself, 4, and Granger to have discussions. It sounds like a banquet. It sounds like a banquet.
I like your word.
4 people of one mind. 4 people of one mind, not with this thing with presidents. There are 4 people of one party and one mind. Going to engage one man of another party and of another mind. to go where? To talk what? Where is the scope for consensus in that environment? Where is the scope for consensus? And given the fact
Amicable decision.
that these 4 people, these 5 people are not an institution of the state, where when decisions are made, these decisions are mandatory for the state to carry them out. It's a gaffe.
Or the interests of the people cannot be
It's a gaffe.
paramount in
It's a
such
photo
engagement.
opportunity. But it is more than that. It comes back to this question of the majority versus the minority. The president feels that he has the right to decide who he must speak with in relation to the minority. This is absurd. People have gone to the polls. They have voted for parties. The People's National Congress, the APNU, AFC, has 40-something% of the votes. The PPP has 50-something%. Right? You want to talk about things national, and you don't respect the people's representative,
That's it.
who is the leader of the opposition, to be the person to talk to. You have to decide. If parties are going to talk, then parties could talk.
Parties could talk.
And that is Jagdeo and Granger. Then they will call in their, what I call their
The wingers, the soldiers.
their creatures.
The creatures.
Because the president is the creature of the PPP. and the leader of the opposition is a creature of the APNU AFC. So that the foundations could speak, the two parties, and that would be a conversation between Granger and Jackie, which conversation they agreed to. So they dupe us. Or the people's representatives
In this case, the leader of the
President?
opposition.
and the leader of the opposition. But no, the president believes that he is president for all of Guyana to the extent that he decides who must speak,
To whom?
who must speak for the people in opposition. He decided that. And it is that this trend is evident even in the manner of selection of the deputy speaker of the National Assembly.
I didn't
The
even remember that
government
one.
used their votes to vote in a party rep whose party get one seat to be deputy speaker and to drown out the voice of a party that has 31 seats as opposed to the PPP's 33 in the National Assembly, the one seat. They'll use their majority to say, you 32 don't, you 31 don't matter. We want this man as the deputy speaker. And so there's a trend. There's a trend. This thing just happened with this president story.
Of
It is a trend
marginalization.
where the government feels it has the authority to decide who speaks for everybody in this country, when in fact they don't represent everybody.
Yeah. I want us to go to quickly to the last one, the ERC conversation. I mean, these are highlights for 2020. And we can't cover everything, but I just
ERC
made a,
conversation is evidence of the trend I just referred to. The ERC is a constitutional body that has a mandate, and they're pursuing their mandate legitimately so, and the president tells them, you don't talk to me, and if you don't talk to me first, then I ain't a part of that. So that what we have is a president who's undermining the Constitution, which is what guides what happens in this country. We don't have a presidential supremacy. In our system, the Constitution is supreme. And everybody is supposed to be subject to the operation of the Constitution. And here is the president saying to the ERC, a constitutional body, that unless you talk to me about what you're doing, then nothing is happening.
all right, I think we're running out of time, Vincent. I see the operators just signal that we're out of time. We started a little late and they give us back some time. I'm very, very thankful for that. I know we could not have exhausted the list that we had done. But of course, I mentioned it earlier, COVID has affected everything, including our activities for the year 2020. That is the Forbes Burnham Foundation. But on today's program, what we try to do is to highlight those major issues that were up for discussion, things that have happened during the year 2020. And Vincent, I must kind of commend you for looking at each of these subject areas that I've listed in a very concise and very clear way. And I trust that those of persons who have listened to this program, unfortunately, I could not have had your contribution while we were on program, but I hope that by the time I get here for the fourth Sunday next month, the phones will be working so that we can engage one another during the course of this program. I want to thank you for having us today, and Vincent, say your last
Well,
thoughts.
once again, to wish the viewers the best for the rest of the season. We look forward to 2021. There are lots and lots of challenges. We've seen what has occurred in 2020. We have not made any mention of the coronavirus. But the fact of the matter is that COVID-19 is symbolic of Guyana 2020. COVID-19 is symbolic of Guyana 2020. And so as we seek to overcome COVID, we also have to seek to overcome what has evolved, unfolded in 2020, and to try to make this Guyana a better place.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank me for having you in your living room. Until the fourth Sunday in January, we'll talk again. My name is Clayton Hines, saying goodbye for now.
And the song is called The Struggle.